Soon we will host the World Cup and the Olympics, both of which I got.
World Cup boycott in a German newspaper.
Calls are growing louder in the United Kingdom for England and Scotland to boycott the 2026 FIFA World Cup that is set to be co-hosted by the United States.
Julius Malema urges countries to boycott the World Cup.
It is not safe to go to America, not only during the World Cup. Any South African who had an intention to go to America, this is not the time. It is dangerous.
8 African nations qualified for the 2026 World Cup, and 8 of them are now facing travel restrictions that could ban their fans from watching their teams play on American soil.
President Trump just announced he's expanding his travel ban to include 5 more countries and impose new limits on others.
This is not about football anymore, and Africa is deciding whether to send the most powerful political message in sports history by walking away from the biggest tournament on the planet. The visa bans are real. The outrage is exploding across the continent, and FIFA is watching its crown jewel tournament turn into a geopolitical disaster as African leaders openly debate whether dignity matters more than goals. Trump's administration dropped a bombshell that nobody saw coming when they announced travel bans affecting 39 countries.
Today, President Trump signed a proclamation to fully or partially suspend entry for nationals from 39 countries into the U.S. That previous list included 19 countries.
And Africa got hit harder than any other continent because out of 9 African teams that qualified, 8 of them are now dealing with restrictions that could effectively lock their fans out of stadiums in the United States. Senegal, Ivory Coast, Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Ghana, and Cape Verde all made it to the World Cup, but their supporters are now staring at visa restrictions, bond requirements up to $15,000, and a gauntlet of bureaucratic obstacles that make attending matches in America nearly impossible for ordinary fans who saved for years just to watch their teams on the world stage. Haiti and Iran face complete travel bans, which means their fans cannot enter the United States at all, even if they have World Cup tickets. And while players and team staff are exempt from these restrictions, the people who make football electric, the fans who paint their faces, who sing in the streets, who turn stadiums into cauldrons of noise, those people are being told they are not welcome. Ivory Coast faces limited visa access due to what the US State Department vaguely describes as diplomatic tensions, and the Trump administration made it clear that possessing a World Cup ticket does not guarantee entry into the country, because visa approval is an entirely separate process controlled by US authorities who can deny anyone for any reason they see fit. The administration suspended immigrant visa processing for 75 countries on top of the existing travel bans, and while they claim this only affects permanent residency applications and not tourist visas, the distinction means nothing to fans who are getting their applications rejected or being told to pay bond fees that cost more than their entire trip. African fans are looking at a system where Europeans can breeze through visa waiver programs while they face interrogations, delays, and fees that feel designed to discourage them from showing up, and the message is unmistakable. The World Cup is being hosted in a country that does not want black and brown people crossing its borders even to watch football. This is bigger than football because Africa is done being treated like a continent that should be grateful just to participate while the rules get bent against them at every turn. The visa restrictions landed at the exact moment when Africa is asserting itself geopolitically like never before, with the Sahel Alliance kicking out Western military bases, BRICS expanding to include African nations that are building trade relationships outside the dollar system, and leaders across the continent openly challenging the post-colonial financial architecture that kept them dependent on Western approval for decades. Africa watching its fans get blocked from the World Cup while FIFA President Gianni Infantino stands next to Trump smiling for photos is the kind of humiliation that triggers responses beyond sport, and the responses are already starting. South Africa's Julius Malema, leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, called for Bafana Bafana and the South African Football Association to withdraw from the tournament entirely, saying business as usual is no longer acceptable when the United States is disrespecting international law the same way apartheid South Africa did. Mailmer compared Trump's visa policies to apartheid-era restrictions and reminded everyone that the global community boycotted South Africa's sports teams for decades to isolate the regime. So why should Africa now reward the United States by sending teams and fans to a country that treats them like security threats? French football legend Claude Leroy, who coached multiple African national teams and holds massive credibility across the continent, publicly questioned whether Africa should call for a boycott given Trump's behavior toward Africa and FIFA refusal to push back against policies that discriminate based on nationality and skin color. Former FIFA president Sepp Blatter, who has no love for the current administration after being forced out in disgrace, joined the calls for a fan boycott of matches in the United States, telling supporters to stay away and watch from home because attending means endorsing a political climate that marginalizes people based on where they were born. British members of Parliament tabled a motion urging global sporting authorities to consider excluding the United States from hosting until it demonstrates compliance with international law. And while that motion has no enforcement power, it signals that even traditional Western allies are uncomfortable with what Trump's policies are doing to the World Cup's credibility as a global celebration. CAF, the Confederation of African Football, has not officially called for a boycott, and no African federation has formally withdrawn, but the silence is deafening because behind the scenes, conversations are happening that could reshape how Africa engages with FIFA tournaments going forward. A coordinated boycott would require joint decisions by the governments of Morocco, Senegal, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Cape Verde, and South Africa, supported by the African Union and backed by CAF. And while that level of coordination seems unlikely in the short term, the fact that it is being openly discussed tells you how serious the anger has become. The financial consequences for FIFA would be catastrophic if Africa walked away because the 2026 World Cup is projected to generate $17.2 billion for the US economy alone, with FIFA expecting record-breaking revenues from ticket sales, sponsorships, and broadcasting rights. Losing 9 African teams would gut the tournament's claim to global inclusivity, and sponsors who paid billions to associate their brands with the World Cup would face immediate backlash for supporting an event that excluded an entire continent due to discriminatory policies. African viewership represents a massive portion of FIFA global audience, and broadcasters in African markets paid substantial fees for rights to air matches featuring their national teams. So a boycott would trigger contract disputes, revenue losses, and a public relations nightmare that FIFA cannot spin away. The image damage would extend far beyond money because the World Cup markets itself as a celebration of unity, when nations put aside differences to compete on equal terms. But if 8 African teams pull out because their fans are banned from attending, that narrative collapses into a story about exclusion, racism, and geopolitical bullying. FIFA has spent years trying to expand the tournament to 48 teams specifically to include more nations from Africa, Asia, and South America, positioning itself as a progressive organization that values diversity and global participation. Yet all of that branding evaporates the moment African fans are told they are too risky to allow into stadiums while European supporters walk through security without a second glance. The political fallout would ripple across every international organization that claims to operate on principles of on principles of equality and fairness, because if FIFA cannot prevent host countries from imposing discriminatory restrictions on participants, then what stops other tournaments, conferences, and summits from doing the same? The precedent being set is that wealthy Western nations can host global events while selectively excluding people based on nationality. And once that precedent is established, it becomes a tool that gets used again and again until international cooperation becomes meaningless because only certain countries get to participate on favorable terms. Other regions are watching closely because Germany's sports leadership is openly discussing whether a boycott makes sense in response to Trump's threats against Greenland and trade wars with the European Union. And while France's sports minister dismissed boycott talk for now, she admitted she cannot predict what might happen if Trump's behavior escalates. Denmark, which has not qualified yet but could make it through playoffs, is seeing fan groups urge the Danish FI to refuse participation if they advance. And Iran already threatened to boycott the draw ceremony after the US denied visas to 4 members of their delegation, signaling that non-African nations are also fed up with being treated as second-class participants in a tournament they helped qualify for. The domino effect is real because if Africa walks away and Germany follows, then suddenly the World Cup loses two of the most passionate football cultures on the planet, and at that point, FIFA faces a legitimacy crisis where the tournament stops being the World Cup and starts being the Americas and Europe Invitational. Corporate sponsors cannot ignore that level of disruption because their entire investment is predicated on global reach, and losing Africa and potentially other regions means losing the diversity that makes the World Cup marketable in the first place. Broadcasters who paid for worldwide rights would demand refunds or renegotiated contracts because the product they purchased, a truly global tournament, no longer exists in the form they agreed to pay for. Africa is not bluffing this time because the continent has reached a tipping point where symbolic gestures no longer satisfy the demand for tangible respect and equal treatment. The Sahel kicked out French troops, ECOWAS lost 3 member states who refused to accept Western-backed sanctions, and African nations are building alternative trade and security frameworks that operate independently of institutions designed in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. Football is the next battleground, where Africa decides whether to keep playing by rules written by people who do not respect them, or whether to walk away and force those people to realize that without African participation, their global events stop being global. The uncomfortable question hanging over everything is whether Africa will actually follow through, or whether this is leverage designed to extract concessions from FIFA and the US State Department without pulling the trigger on a full boycott. CAF has not issued ultimatums, federations have not withdrawn, and players who dreamed their entire lives of representing their countries at a World Cup are not eager to sacrifice that dream over visa policies that might get adjusted at the last minute to avoid disaster. The economic pressure on African football associations is real because participating in the World Cup generates revenue that funds grassroots development, and walking away means losing that income with no guarantee that the boycott achieves its political objectives. But leverage only works if the threat is credible, and right now, the threat is credible because African leaders are publicly questioning whether the humiliation of sending teams to a country that bans their fans is worth the money and prestige that comes with World Cup participation. FIFA is in full damage control mode, insisting that everything is fine while quietly pressuring the US State Department to ease restrictions before the tournament starts. But the damage is already done because African fans, players, and officials now know that their participation is conditional on policies they have no control over, and that can change at any moment based on the whims of a US administration that views them as security risks rather than welcomed guests. The 2026 World Cup was supposed to be a historic expansion that brought more of the world into football's biggest event, but instead, it is turning into a test of whether Africa will accept being treated as lesser participants or whether the continent will use its leverage to demand the respect it has been denied for decades. If Africa boycotts, it sends a message that dignity is not negotiable and that global events lose their legitimacy the moment they exclude people based on where they were born. If Africa participates despite the restrictions, it signals that money and prestige matter more than principle, and that calculation will define how the continent is treated in every international forum going forward. The world is watching, and so is history, because this is not just about football anymore. It is about whether Africa will continue bending to systems designed to exploit and exclude, or whether this is the moment when a continent decides enough is enough and walks away from a rigged game that was never meant to be fair in the first place. The countdown to June 2026 is ticking, and nobody knows yet whether African teams will take the field or whether the World Cup will start with 9 empty slots and a global audience asking how FIFA let things get this bad.
What you're seeing, how immigrants are being treated in America. But my knowledge of World Cup the world over, I've covered quite a few. I've been to Germany, I've been to South Korea. When the World Cup happens, the whole mood in a country often changes. The country itself knows that the whole spotlight is on them, and anything that they tend to do that could put them in bad light, they are going to try and change. So I think Trump and his people will mellow when the World Cup comes, and I think any South African who can afford, my view is go to the World Cup, don't miss it, because it's something that comes once in a lifetime, especially when your country is there, because you see not every country qualifies all the time, so people should not be afraid.